We are a history museum, and you don't need to know a lot about Seattle history to know that something really special is happening in our community. But what you might not know is that something special has been happening in Seattle for about 160 years when it comes to innovation. And the story is almost always the same, and I bet we're going to hear it again this evening a lot. It's young people, almost always, with very smart ideas, willing to take big risks, to go to scale, and then to change the world. What was once implausible becomes indispensable, and that is sort of the Made in Seattle pattern. And it's a pattern that has been happening for a century and more, and it continues to happen today. And that's what the Seattle 10 program is all about. For the last 5 years, we here at the Museum of History and Industry have been working with John Cook and the amazing team at GeekWire to salute the most important startups of the year, to find those who are making history happen right now, to get their ideas, their big ideas, on even bigger cocktail napkins. This year's class you can see suspended from the railing over there. And then those napkins, encapsulating those great ideas, become a permanent part of the museum's collection. They really become the stuff of Seattle history. So imagine, if you would, 50 years from now, seeing the original thoughts that led to the creation of these amazing companies. That's going to be a unique resource, and we're really happy to have it. John asked me to provide a little bit of the historic context, and I'll just take a second here because they haven't given me a podium, and I have to stand in front of my friends here, so I'll make this very short. But if Seattle had a day one, it probably would go back to a November day in the 1850s, when a group of 20-somethings arrived on the farthest part of the North American continent with a very big idea in mind. They found a new technology, and they pooled all their resources, and they made a very risky investment. In that instance, it was a steam-powered sawmill, but it immediately introduced Seattle to the industrial economy, to international trade. It launched us into Pacific Rim trade. It launched us into high tech, and that was a century and a half before those terms were even coined. Seattle was on the cutting edge from that moment, and it set a pattern that pretty much repeated itself throughout the 19th century. For example, consider 26-year-old Asa Mercer, who started the University of Washington in the 1860s. He had no books, he had no students, he had practically no money, but he was determined to build the intellectual capital that it took to make an innovative region. Or a 19-year-old guy named Jim Casey, who rode through the city on his bicycle in the 1890s. The bicycle at the time was a high-tech innovation, delivering packages to ships that were heading out for the goldfields of Alaska, a mobile fulfillment service that grew eventually to become UPS, which was born right here in Seattle. He was 19. Bill Boeing was in his early 30s when he built that plane above your heads, which was the first piece of commercial aviation. He used local craftspeople, and he combined it with new technology. His engineer was a young Chinese student, 19 years old, whose name was Wang Su, who Boeing recruited to Seattle in the early 20th century to employ this international talent base to create an entirely new industry, but one based on existing businesses. Buoyed by those kinds of business successes in the 20th century, Seattle fostered not just businesses of innovation, but an entire culture of innovation, investing in public education, investing in infrastructure like the regrading of the city streets and the creation of a port, and promoting global trade. And it made it a point to welcome newcomers as well. It's no surprise that this very small city at the time audaciously hosted 2 World's Fairs in just 50 years' time, rolling out not just big ideas, but rolling out a welcome mat that brought thousands of people to this community, many of whom actually stayed and put down roots. And all those investments paid off, and they paid off with some unexpected dividends. The region's well-educated workforce, focused on innovation, soon tackled environmental challenges and tackled civic challenges, like the cleanup of Lake Washington, which was the most major environmental undertaking up to that time in the 1950s, just done by community leaders who understood the technology of environmental stewardship and the civic mandate of that. By the 1970s and 1980s, Washington cities, particularly Seattle, were beginning to be cited as the most livable places, and they were nurturing a stream of young entrepreneurs, both homegrown like Bill Gates and Paul Allen, and newcomers to the region as well, who understood that Seattle existed at the intersection of innovation and livability. The trajectory of that history, of course, propels us in the 20th century as we welcome thousands of residents every month and lead the world in everything from cloud computing to coffee to all the industries that you all are associated with today. But time and again, we hear that familiar refrain from the first startups of 160 years ago, that a technologically innovative community thrives best when it empowers a young workforce, invests in education and infrastructure, and welcomes newcomers as it reaches out to the world beyond. It's a history lesson this city has taken to heart since 1851. Well, to help us better understand that history as it is being made today, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, the longest-serving and most followed journalist on the Pacific Northwest Tech Beat, and the co-founder of GeekWire. Please welcome John Cook.
Cool. Thanks, Leonard. Well, as a history major, I just love hearing that. I could go on, but we're going to dive into more of the future. First off, a big thanks to MOHAI. We love the Seattle 10 program. We launched it 5 years ago, and it's just been a great program recognizing up-and-coming startups. So thanks to MOHAI for kicking off this great program with us. And I think, lessons in there that Leonard touched on in terms of this transition from, the high-tech sawmills to software. And so we're gonna cover a little bit about the history of Seattle, what makes it an innovative hub, what's coming next, and also talk about some lessons learned from our great panelists here tonight. And I'm really excited about this panel. Handpicked, I think we have a really lively group, no shrinking violets here. We're gonna have a really interactive discussion, and certainly room for you to voice up and share some of your insights as well, and have some questions answered as well. So I'll move from left to right, moving down the stage. Chase Jarvis, the CEO of Creative Live, award-winning photographer. Chase is one of the most talented entrepreneurs that we've come across in the Seattle region, and we're just thrilled to have him here tonight. Mike McSherry, he's the CEO of Zelth. He's a 2017 Seattle 10 winner. You can see the Zelth banner there on the far corner in the back of the museum. Mike has been around the tech ecosystem for a number of years. I've covered some of his original companies. Who has an Android device in the audience here? Raise your hand if you have an Android device. Okay. Who's used Swipe, text input, Swipe to put in text? Mike was the CEO of that company, Swipe, which sold to Nuance, a very successful outcome here in the Seattle area, and now at Zelth is trying to transform aspects of the healthcare business, which is a big challenge, obviously. Of course, Avni Patel Thompson of Poppy. We're really thrilled to have her here as well tonight. And Kristen Hamilton, the CEO of Koru and co-founder of Onvia. And we're thrilled to have all of you. So let's have a big warm welcome for this group tonight. Cool. So we're certainly going to talk a lot about the future here tonight, but since we are in the Museum of History and Industry, I wanted to take a step back and just talk about history. We've had as I said, this movement from sawmills to software, this really interesting transition here in Seattle as we've developed into a real innovation hub. But I want to start out by asking if there is a special trait that makes up the entrepreneurial ecosystem here. Is there one thing that stands out to you that makes this a special place to be an entrepreneur? And I'll open that up to any of you.
I'll take
Thanks,
a stab. So I think one thing that I've had a chance to observe over the last 2 or 3 years that I've been doing startups as opposed to my traditional sort of corporate career, I've had a chance to spend time in Vancouver, Canada, Seattle, and then down in the Valley for significant parts of that. And I think what I love about basing my company here in Seattle is I feel like there's a lot of entrepreneurship that's just heads down, get it done. So what is it that we're trying to do? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And a lot of just like grit and, just wanting to solve a problem. And so I've always really appreciated that, that aspect of it, because I think that also breeds the culture of this ecosystem, and something that I really, value versus, perhaps down in the Valley or other cities.
Yeah. Chase, how about you? You spend a lot of time between San Francisco and Seattle, so you probably see a lot of these differences. What's the cultural trait that makes Seattle a special place to be an entrepreneur?
I would echo grit. I think that's really appropriate. But I'd add one thing to that, and that's there's a little bit of nuts. There's a little bit of crazy. But just John, you're a history buff. We're here in MOHAI. But think of the history behind how this area of the country was settled. People went west, and then they went further west, and the craziest people kept going west, and then that crazy group found some gold, and then they figured, well, there's probably some more gold, so they started going north, and you're getting fewer and fewer people, and they're getting crazier and crazier. And so ultimately, we end up here in the Northwest. If you go to Alaska, you know what you get. And so I think from a heritage perspective, I truly believe that there's a unique sort of sense of grit and get it done, and very resourceful, a very resourceful bunch that I think it speaks volume about the art in the city here. I think the technology, if you look at the creator scene, there's very few places in the world where you get the eclectic mix that we have here in the city, and it's something I'm really proud of as my own city here, our own here in the 206, and it's something that I wear on my sleeve when I travel, because I'm proud of it.
Cool. Kristen or Mike?
Yeah, I think the two words that come to mind for me, and it's hard to not think of ourselves in relationship to Silicon Valley because we're talking about technologies and startups, but to me it's about camaraderie. The ecosystem of innovation here is incredibly supportive, and the other piece I would say is humility. So the foundation of the Seattle area being loggers and miners and people who, if you read Boys in the Boat, and I'm a rower too, really it's kind of amazing. It's this ragtag group of people who made their way into the city from the woods in a lot of ways, and the fact that the first innovation was a sawmill is kind of exciting that way. I'm Canadian, and so for me, this is the big city, and we're as far south as I've ever had a zip code, but it's incredible to be kind of surrounded by that sense of hard work, authenticity, and also camaraderie. So it translates into the ecosystem for entrepreneurs in that we will be interviewing the same person for a job in our competitive companies, and we will share information, which is not something that happens in other places, I think. So I really appreciate that. I've always felt extremely included in the ecosystem that's been more male dominant, which I think is very special and unique, and especially with all that we hear about that these days. So that humility and that sense of just earnest, how do we figure it out? How do we get it done? I would say typifies what we see here in terms of the tech ecosystem.
Mike, anything to add?
Generally echo that. The intellectual curiosity, highly educated, and so people, there's almost a perceived arrogance or ego that I can solve that problem. There is a problem, and I'm willing to tackle it, I'm willing to put the hard yards in, and I'm willing to lay it on the line to try and prove to the world against that. But that also follows with the humility that we're not out flashy. It's not spending big on successes. It's trying to prove that to yourself and to your friends that I'm able to achieve this and bring this idea to market and to bear. But it all stems from an intellectual curiosity, and we've got the resources around here to try to solve the problems that exist.
So if you look at the 20th century, especially as it relates to Seattle and the industry that was created here, it really revolves around a few areas. Aerospace, obviously, software, could even argue coffee. What do you think the defining technology will be for the 21st century, especially as it relates to Seattle or just more broadly?
Human capital.
What do you mean by that?
The characteristics that we described here, curiosity, horsepower, grit, all those are human traits. I think the concept, you mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley. Our lead is Greylock, so I'm down there all the time. And they have a lot of the sort of the wall covering. There's a lot of all the essential things. You've got a lot of executive horsepower. You got a lot of sort of the window dressing. That's not to say there's not crazy horsepower. Like if you look at what's like 2/3 of the value of the NASDAQ is in 100 square miles down there. But it lacks this sort of grit and human capital. People go down there to get higher quality talent. I think there's insane talent here, and that's going to continue to define and redefine what goes on. I think that we're about to see a mass exodus from Silicon Valley. Most of the friends that I know are going to places like Seattle. They're going to Austin, Texas is getting a huge swath of the people that are doing cool shit in San Francisco right now. They're leaving. And I think what is attractive about Seattle is this human component. I think you can come here and you can make not just a living but a life. I think there's people that you want to spend time with. And the flip side of when you have an area like Silicon Valley, people come there for the opportunity, but it's a really weird, I mean, I live in the city, and like my building is full of 22-year-olds who walk around their phone driving $600,000 cars. It's totally bizarre. Versus here, there's this grit and there's this, I think the human element is, it transcends any of the other sort of tech hubs that I've ever sort of set foot in.
And so I might be biased, but I echo shades of that as well. So my company's Poppy, so we find and we vet these amazing childcare providers and we match them up with families when they need care. And so I'm biased in this, but if I think about the next century, I am a huge believer of how can we unlock human potential leveraging technology. So I know we can talk about AI and machine learning and blockchain and all of this kind of stuff, and I think they're incredible technologies. Like my theoretical brain just kind of whirs at all the possibility, but ultimately it comes down to something very human. How do we unlock people to be the best version of themselves with technology? And so I think about that in the context of Poppy. How can we leverage this technology? Because I don't think we're, obviously in my world, I don't think we're outsourcing humans in the care of our children and all that kind of stuff, but how can we leverage technology to make it safer, smarter, better for everybody involved? And so my answer to that is I think there's lots of exciting up-and-coming technologies, but I think it's in the context in which it's unlocking human potential that I'm really excited.
I think it's always hard to predict the future. Amazon hasn't been mentioned, and no matter what they stick their finger in, it usually seems to become a big market opportunity. So what they do next will potentially move the market quite a bit. We've been lucky to have been blessed with cloud services. The epicenter of cloud, sits here, and what businesses get created off of that. Juno, a pharmaceutical company, just got bought for $9 billion today. Providence, my company was incubated and spun out of Providence, is now the, third or fourth biggest hospital system in the country. They're rumored to merge with another one to become the biggest in the country. So pharmaceutical, healthcare, medical services, what's coming out of UW. So that could be another large industry. But I think it's incredibly hard to predict what it's going to be. Is it space? Are we going to become colonization of the moon? I mean, you've got Bezos's efforts. You've got SpaceX building large enterprises here. You've got, what Boeing's, trying to achieve in that. So it's incredibly hard to predict. But we've got the foundation. We've got the companies that are at the basis of all of these potentials in the future, and that's what's super exciting about Seattle. Is we've got the groundwork to, no matter what vertical becomes big in the future, we've got the resources, the education, the talent, the human capital to try and achieve and execute on that. And I think you're going to see continued growth opportunities in Seattle and a number of more diverse technology platforms.
Yeah, so I'll be quick. I had a chance to be an entrepreneur in residence at Mavron, one of the big venture funds in Seattle, for a period of time. And when I was there, I heard Internet of Things for the first time, and along came some entrepreneurs pitching about Internet of Things, and I was like, whoa, that's crazy, like that's exciting. And then all of a sudden it sort of happened, right? So now this is really an evolution that's a revolution, I guess, in a lot of ways. And then artificial intelligence and machine learning is really a buzzword that everyone's very excited about. And the promise of these things usually becomes very hyped, and then the reality is some other version of that in terms of early execution. But what's amazing is actually what's, like when I was working at Microsoft in the mobile devices division, we were talking about this idea of why would you ever watch video on a phone in a screen that's this size. This was like 2001, I guess it was. And then there would be these crazy, audacious ideas about what could be, and we'd back off of that to start with. But what's incredible about the technology revolution that we're all living in is that you get there. You get to that massive vision. So I believe that, you know, we've seen in this short amount of time, Internet of Things, I heard it for the first time, I don't know, 5 years ago, and now it's like executed. So I think that machine-aided human decision-making is something that goes throughout any innovation, and I'm super excited about, because we're not going to have the robots take over in any near-time future. I don't think that is actually something that will completely see itself to fruition, because it won't be the most innovative thing we can do. But anything in any of those technology areas where you have machine-aided improved human decision-making, to me, that's the biggest innovation that will take place. And it is a very human thing. It helps us to be our better selves. It also helps us to, you know, mean that we can actually find the right people to do the right work and find ourselves into the right kind of work.
So tonight's title is Lessons Learned from the Seattle 10. So, you know, just thinking about advice for people that might have a startup or they're working at any sort of business here, if you were looking back at your own careers and your entrepreneurial career, what advice would you give to yourself if you were just starting out?
If you can sleep at night with the problem not being solved, don't do it. So in other words, it has to be in terms of starting a business, I think it has to be such a calling for you, because the sacrifices are so huge. And also the trail to solving a big problem is so treacherous and full of pitfalls and pain that if I look back, I had lunch with someone today who had a business idea, and I was like, yeah, anything's possible. And here's also, make sure you can't live without this problem not being solved, you know? So that's a piece of advice I'd give to people thinking about going down that path.
I think for me, I think procrastination is a huge, and it's not procrastination, but I think when people are thinking about a problem that they want to solve or a startup that they want to start, I think you can make the idea so big in your head that you want to think through all the different ways it could happen, or do the research and all that kind of stuff. And I think if there's one thing I know, it's that you know, startups just, you can't predict it, and all the learning happens in the field. And so you have to have a first hypothesis, you have to get started, and you have to commit to it and go. So for me, the biggest piece of advice I usually give people is that if you're really serious about this, if this is an idea that you're so obsessed about that it compels you to create it in the world, then just get started. And then you'll learn a lot more in a short period of time about whether there is something there, whether you want to be committed to it. But I think so many people let that just live in their heads for a really long time. It's not a bad thing, I get it, right? Because there's a very good chance that it probably won't survive, right? So like some people like the safety blanket of having it in their heads. But if it is something that you feel strongly about, this is what your life is about, I would say just get started.
So there's a dichotomy in this answer, but the earlier you get started, the more likely you are to pursue an entrepreneurial path. The later you wait, you've got bills, you've got mortgages, you've got children, you've got school payments, you've got orthodontics, blah, blah, blah. It just gets hard to give up the salary and compensation to pursue the risk-reward ratio of an entrepreneurial life. Now that said, you don't have the experience when you're in your 20s or 30s to pursue it. So you have to have more of that wild, crazy hubris to just say, hell with it, I'm going to try and figure this out. But you also don't have bills, so go for it. So that's one path that I'd say. The second is most startups fail. I hear too many conversations around optimization of equity, control, and board, and this and this and this, and de-risk at all costs to try and make your startup successful early on. Especially if it's your first one, it's more about training wheels and getting a successful company off the ground and sold and exited, and then earn your money on the next one. But that very first one, take all the help you can get in the form of investment equity and board support and participation and advice. So those are two thoughts.
Advice to your early self, Chase.
Early, not that's going to be too early, not one early. Okay, so early self is like the concept of a secret is just fiction. Okay, just like your idea, no one gives two shits about your idea.
NDAs are bullshit.
Yes. I advise a lot of companies. I'm an investor in probably 10. If anyone approaches me with the concept of an NDA, it's just like, sorry, you don't have any idea what's happening. Let me help you understand that no one gives two shits about your idea. If anyone does, they're probably too busy solving some other problem to decide to stop everything in their busy-ass life, put their kids on hold, pick them up later at school, put the 2 other startups that they've got on hold to go do this thing. No chance. What you want is friends. You want advocates. You want partners. You want people to know about your thing. This is advice to Seattle, not to my younger self, but stop looking at your shoes. Look up, look at other people, connect. This is I appreciate the humility that Seattle has. I come from a Scandinavian background, humility, hard work, all those things. That totally screws with Seattle. That totally messes with us. Get up, get out, put your hand up, stand up for things, volunteer. There should be twice as many people in the crowd here. Not because of anything that anyone has or hasn't done to mark, like curiosity, hunger, passion, all those things that we got so many people that are like, at their WeWork, looking at their shoes right now, going, oh, should I go out? I don't know if that. And this is, again, it's not trying to throw rocks, but what we have to do, and I think if we're willing to get together as a group, we have to decide what's going to make the Seattle scene better. And so we can pat each other on the back. What do we love about Seattle? We can go, and again, I don't want to just be cheerleading. What can we do better? We can get out. We can care. We can stand up. We can say, this is my startup. I'm proud of it. It's sort of this. There's just a level that is required to get this shit done. And unless you've done it, you have no idea. I'm telling you, it's very, 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 very difficult for you to be successful if no one knows what you're doing. Just.
Do you think
that's where GeekWire and John come to play?
Yes.
Every startup needs funding and PR. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Chase, building on that, do you think that that's different in Seattle versus other tech ecosystems that you've hung out in?
It's differenter than every other one, to the detriment. I'm so disappointed. The people are so concerned that someone might find out you actually have ambition in Seattle. It's literally, and it's such a shoe, and it comes from a great place, a hardworking, humble, the humility that's involved with not wanting to, but it's like if you go out with a group of friends in New York, you're going to meet other people, and you're standing at the bar, you're going to say, and I'm not really a go-outy type party person, but you always end up meeting someone else, and they come over to your table like, oh yeah, this is Bobby, he does whatever. In Seattle, you Seattle freeze, right? We apply that to our startup mentality, which is toxic and it hurts your business's ability to be successful. The more you stay in and work, and the more no one knows about your shit, the worse off you're going to be. And that's like, you have to cross your T's, but doing the work, we celebrate for doing the work. That's like the get in the door fee, right? Doing the work, it's like, good job, you did the work. That's 50% of the deal. People have to care about the thing that you built. And if you and your 10 friends are high-fiving in your parents' basement, nothing's happening. So I'm passionate about this, and I tell every Seattle entrepreneur, like, this whole idea of your idea is secret, like, that's fiction. You need to tell as many people, you need to get all kinds of people excited, and you need to ask a lot of questions. And here's where you're humble. You get it wrong a lot, and you learn, and you iterate quickly. And that doesn't happen if you're only high-fiving with your 10 friends.
So this is speaking to the cultural aspects of our society here in Seattle. Do you think there is hope to change that? Do you think it is changing? Do you think it's changing as more people from outside of Seattle come into the community for either the better or the worse?
I don't know, Mike should.
I've spent a lot of time in the Bay Area doing startups, and actually in Australia, I lived there for 4 years, and as you were commenting about that, they've got a phrase down there called the tall poppy syndrome, where if anything is too tall, it's like, this arrogant, someone's, beyond just the norm, the average, you got to cut them down by cynicism and sarcasm. And so the tall poppy syndrome is everybody should just be average. But that's not what you want to try and, achieve, and you need to promote yourself, as Chase was saying. Although I've seen the extreme, right? You're the Bay Area and you're running around and you're job hopping and you're networking and I've got this latest greatest job and you're bragging, and that's not Seattle scene, and I don't want to get there either. I think it's back to our humility that we build our own software. I think one of the big besides Amazon, I guess, which has now become more of a consumer play, a huge consumer play. The ding on Seattle was we don't develop consumer software businesses, and that might be we're not great promoters and evangelists and on that level, but we've built a hell of a platform on B2B, and that's solving real business problems, and the whims and craziness of trying to cater to fickle consumer tastes is a tough proposition. And the Bay Area has the venture funding to go after that. We don't have that same infrastructure support at this level now, but God damn it, Gates and Ballmer and Allen and all those guys need to
But don't you think it's not going to change? It's not going to change, and we'll continue to be great B2B cloud people unless we do something to shift the mentality of what we believe. Like, we all live in story, right? You're telling yourself a story, and that's what you do. Whether you tell yourself that you're fill in the blank, you're X or Y, you tend to live out that story. And we're telling ourselves we're this sort of story, and hey, we've built some of the biggest businesses that the world has ever seen.
Well, I mean, Amazon famously would never do an ad until 2-3 years ago, and so now they're building out this huge competency, and people are cycling out of Amazon left, right, and center. So you're going to start to see more and more consumer-focused brand attention, awareness, driven businesses. So I think it's going to come. It's a cycle, and you'll see more of that spinning out, especially from
we have more B2B history, so there are less consumer companies. That makes sense because of the history of where we came from. But so it's interesting to hear you say that. What you say is very American. It's sort of like stand up and talk louder, and so people will hear you more. And it's
or tweet more with caps.
I think it's really important. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't, you can't just be all full of air and have no substance. I think there's so much substance here that people aren't saying, I got something dope, you guys should check it out.
Look at the turnaround that Ledger, almost on his own shoulders, has done at T-Mo with his brand and marketing.
John Ledger at T-Mobile.
But I think the thing it's exciting about what you're saying is that we need to be more open. And the Seattle Freeze historically, who grew up in Seattle? Okay, so that's actually good. So there are a lot of people who I'm friends with who grew up in Seattle that actually tend to hang out with people that grew up in Seattle also historically, and that's created the Seattle Freeze. But now there's so much growth, it's starting to break it apart a little bit. So I agree with you, and I moved to this country knowing 0 people, so I had to create this this community for myself. But I think it's interesting to think about a different way to get there, though, because the bravado of New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco is not necessarily the right thing for Seattle. I'm not sure it's the way that this city is going to see its way into the future. We have not created problems for ourselves of bro culture here to fix yet, and we might not. That's sort of exciting to me. I feel like there are ways in which we can grow and be audacious without being trying to be the same as how those things evolved in other places. And I do think it's more of an international market. So we are a startup, and we work in 3 continents. My first startup on Via went public. We never thought of working in 2 countries before being public because the idea was focus on one market. Now venture capitalists invest globally. You're doing business globally constantly, and we work with Australia, and we've learned the poppy thing. And if you come across as the brash, loud American, then the poppy people don't want to do business with you. So it's actually kind of an interesting point, and I agree with you. I find myself saying to friends, we should all be more open. It's good to meet new people. You never know when you're going to meet your new best friend. But at the same time, I like the idea. I've been talking to fellow CEOs and people who have been in the tech scene for a long time in the startup world to say it's exciting to me that we have this thing that's different, and I wonder if we should put some words around it. Like, I wonder if we should put some principles around it so that we say, here is what we are about, not what we're not about. We're not San Francisco. We've been saying that for a really long time. But what is it that we embody? There's more, I feel like there's a culture of inclusion here that's stronger than other places. I think there's a way to maintain that. And I think when you stand up and start talking loud, then all of a sudden, maybe you don't listen as much.
I was just
John,
gonna,
Sorry,
I was just gonna add like 2 cents. Like, my observation though is that I like sort of see both of you guys' points in the sense that what I feel like we're lacking is the ambition, the sheer broad ambition.
I'm not talking about bravado.
No, so
at all.
Like, when I go down to the valley, what I do
Zero.
miss, like up here, is that when I'll go for like I don't know, happy hour or whatever, and you're talking to people and they're pushing the envelope on, I don't know, when we're talking about AI and like singularity and like shit that I have like, what are you talking about? And I'm like racing to try to keep up with them. There's an energy and excitement of trying to push boundaries constantly. And they're not talking about, I want to build a company that's going to be the best in California or the best in whatever. And in some ways, sometimes we are thinking about, I'm building something, I want to be the best in Pacific Northwest. No, we're building companies that are going to be the best in the freaking world. They just happens to be headquartered here in Seattle. And so I do love that we have not created problems that we need to now go solve, and because of bravado and other other excess money and time and all that other excess. But I do think, if I had to observe, it's that let's be okay with just sheer ambition. Yeah. With just like being incredible and letting, and so what I do love, which I don't know whether they realized it or not, but like Amazon of the past was just very heads down. You guys can keep all your drama about whether we're a tech company or not, Google, Apple, everything. We're just going to do this, and we know what we're about. And now, my Canadian came out. But now they're like, okay, now we're expanding, and I feel like that is also seeping into the rest of the Seattle ecosystem.
Bingo.
Because And I feel that too, because now there's other people coming here and all that, and Amazon's saying, yeah, now we're going to do an HQ too, and like, yeah, bid for us, and like, they've got literally everyone dancing for them, right? And so I think some of that, now let's be careful that that doesn't turn into, again, hubris and all the rest of it, but if I had to connect the dots, it's like, we're lacking ambition, and we should be completely okay with just like
What's worse
swinging.
is I think we have the ambition, we're just too full of our own worry, we're in our own head, that we're unwilling to say we have ambition because of the way we were raised. And to me, that has zero to do with bro culture. Top 25 places for women to work, Creative Live. Okay? Yeah. So not bro culture, it's very much about what is it that you want to do, and if you don't want people to know about your thing, no one's going to know about your thing. I'm talking like, I think Amazon is the perfect example. Amazon started to turn up the heat on and really change the game when they got out of their shell. When they said, this is who we are, this is what our ambitions are, we started being really clear about it. To me, that's a phenomenal example, and it's not the tall poppy. I think that's a really interesting way of that Australian mentality. I think that's not what I'm talking about. And I think we're smart enough in this audience to know the difference between like, yeah, bro, I'm sick, I'm awesome, versus building something and saying, I want this to be the best in the world, I want to do this, I want to hire the best executives, I want to drive the most growth in the region and drive jobs, and I think those are things that we can be okay with. And then it can't be hollow. I just think to me, this is phenomenal. Like this discussion, like I would have it every day until the city wakes up.
Yeah, great stuff.
John, you're growing your own startup.
Yes.
You've been growing your own startup, and you're competing against much larger, more brash, bravado, headline grabbing.
Bravado in media.
What is this?
A lot of headline.
Yeah.
How do you reflect upon Seattle versus?
Well, it's interesting because I think about it in the context of GeekWire and what we've built in our own startup. And part of what I think has made us unique is that we are a media company not based in New York or San Francisco, where there is a lot of bravado and a lot of money that goes into it. And we were kind of heads down here in the Northwest, doing our own thing, seeing the world through a different prism than kind of the rest of the world. And I think that's made us successful, frankly. I think our geography has made us successful. Now, we have much grander ambitions than just the Pacific Northwest, and we want to expand our operations and get as many readers and as much audience as we can. But we are certainly defined, I think, by our geography, and we certainly have a sense of place that I think makes us stand out and different and do things in a little bit of an oddball and playful way that maybe some more serious media organizations would be more heads down or raising a bunch of money to go hire 100 reporters and go attack a problem and then running out of money and going out of business. And so I think our spirit has been bootstrap, be serious, heads down, and then this little bit of oddball, keeping it weird in the Northwest, which we like. So, but you know, it's interesting, the conversation has talked, we've talked a lot about comparisons to the Bay Area and San Francisco and Seattle. And I want to pick up on something Kristen was saying about, you know, 10 years ago, a lot of people in the startup ecosystem of Seattle were saying, oh gosh, how can we be more like San Francisco? There's so much money there. They've got all these cool startups coming up. And it was a real theme of people talking about it and being really concerned, like, gosh, we need to up our game. We need to be a bigger player on the scene. And I think in the last 3 to 5 years, that dialogue has really changed in the Seattle tech community to the point where people are now saying, how do we not become San Francisco? They look at San Francisco as a messed up city with a lot of problems that has pushed out, you know, the firemen and the police officers and the educators, and left with kind of this weird shell of a city. And I guess my question for the panelists is, how do we prevent that from happening in Seattle? Because there are signs we're on that trajectory. And what can the tech community do to make sure that you know, the tide rises with all boats here?
Yeah, I'm really interested. I'm really curious about what you said, Chase, because I've not experienced the lack of ambition here. I've experienced a lack of like ecosystem here with respect to the opportunity. So I feel like people are like, I'm going to crush it, I'm going to become, but they just don't stand up on the stage and say it. And actually, it's a great point.
You have to pin someone down to have them tell you what they care about. And that's why there is no ecosystem, because no one's talking to anyone else. They're not exchanging ideas because they're heads down in their basement building the next version of the thing, and they don't want to tell anybody about it until it's out.
Well, I know to some degree that's correct, but to some degree the big companies you mentioned, and Amazon being one of them, is not necessarily the greatest example here, because I think they are pretty cut off from the rest of the community and the rest of the technology ecosystem here. I mean, it has really only been in the last year or two that Amazon, in my mind, has changed path to try to engage a little bit. And I don't know whether that's motivated out of you know, HR and recruiting, out of pure PR, out of things have really changed culturally there. I'm suspect of it, but I don't know where they are. But so historically, they are the most heads down looking at their shoes of anybody.
Yeah. All right, on the spot, any Amazon employees out there?
Oh, good. Well, let's keep chatting negatively.
All right. So, but hold on. So, any Microsoft employees? Yeah. So that's very common. That those big companies are super isolated. Not to call you out, but I invited a couple of recently hired execs to Microsoft from the Bay Area to say you should come to this thing because a lot of people are very Redmond-centric when they get hired into Microsoft, and so there's something I am really just processing out loud because I'm like, wow, that's so interesting. You know, when I moved here from Canada, granted, it's all where you came from, I was like, wow, they're so ambitious and everyone's so like, you know, anything's possible and there's this money you can get and you can't get that in Canada. So it was all relative. Ironically, we're trading places with Canada in terms of the entrepreneurial policies, which is fascinating. But the point you make about there's like actually something about the lack of social community around entrepreneurship. It's actually like you can go out every single night in other cities, let's use that big city, San Francisco, and there'll be like some cool thing where you're trading stories. But some of it feels to me like, I used to use this term, entrepreneurship as sport. So it's gone from one extreme to the other. When I started on via 1997, there was like no entrepreneurs. Everyone I went to business school with was like, you're doing what? We work at Procter & Gamble, we work at Deloitte, and like big company things, and we were doing this ridiculous thing that no one wanted to do. And so we were very alone. There was no one to talk to. I mean, they would be, and you know, Micah was doing Atom Films at the same time. Like we were in this very small group. Now it's like there's more of a community about it, but it's also, there's like, almost like, who's gotten to the place where they have really started to build something? And that to me is this middle ground of people who are, there's a lot more of them. It's just starting to burgeon and grow in Seattle, where you've actually built a company, you're not, you know, just officing at WeWork, and that's a good thing to do, but just sort of think about entrepreneurship. But how can those people support one another and be in each other's ecosystem? It's actually, to some extent, an issue of scale. We're growing that group of people now to the point where you have a community and you have a group of people. But Microsoft execs are in Redmond. Amazon has been relatively isolated. And then it's this group of people that have kind of started to form a community. And I think it's up to us, actually, to define it.
But also, to your ambition.
They're really going for me, you guys.
No. But for startups to actually thrive and succeed, you need the idea, the horsepower, the team that's going to build that. You need investment to grow and scale the business, and then you need the marketing, PR, exposure, ecosystem, et cetera, on that. And there's no VCs in town that are going for moonshot investment proposals.
Yep.
Not like you see in the Bay Area, especially in China, going on right now. The only ones that'll touch consumer are Mavron, ad hoc briefly, pending on whims, and Madrona, but Madrona's not going for moonshot proposals. Everybody else wants to focus on B2B. So you don't really see that funding, whereas in the Bay Area, there's a dozen VCs that say, unless you potentially have $1 billion exit potential, I'm not even interested in placing a bet in you guys. They're only going for moonshots, and that's the thesis for the big guys with billion-dollar funds down there. So I think that's one thing that's lacking, and I would like to see more of that cycled into the Seattle startup entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's been lamented, the lack of VC funding and the closing of some of the past venture groups. But that said, Founders Co-op is growing larger funds. PSL just raised a larger fund, and I think you're going to start to see a resurgence in venture dollars that'll pursue more audacious dreams here.
And Silicon Valley investors are much more likely to invest outside of Silicon Valley than they used to be.
Oh, yeah.
So that's
if
good.
you're going to raise money in Seattle,
go down
I
there.
absolutely suggest you go do tours down in the Bay Area and find out if there's more relevant.
That
VCs
is the
there.
adage. Raise your money in the Valley, build your company in
Hire
Seattle.
your engineers in Seattle.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Chase, you had a point on that.
So let's play a game real quick. Look around the room and look for shit that's red. Okay, some red stuff.
The tow truck's pink.
So yeah, you saw like 5 red things. How many things that were green did you see? You didn't even look for green, and my point is that you only see what you're looking for. So if we're walking around with our heads focused specifically and we're only going to build B2B businesses that meet this market cap and do this thing, then we're going to continue to do that. And I think your point about like what kind of venture folks do we have here, I think that's really interesting. But I bet if we had an unbelievable growth-centric consumer internet company that was crushing it, that Madrona would be the first one that they would love that deal. They would want to have that deal. And so we need, like, there's this saying who we are, like this concept of defining ourselves that I'm actually sort of very, very antithetically oriented toward that. I don't like defining who we are, because as soon as you define who you are, then you define who you're not. And these companies will succeed, these companies won't. We're going to be like this and not like that. I think as a human being, defining who you are is great. But just as varied and myriad as the human beings that are in this room, that's what the startup ecosystem should look and feel like in Seattle. And as well, we keep saying we're like this and we're not like that. As a community, that's weird.
Well,
There's one point, which is, look at what happened to the music scene in Seattle in the 80s and 90s. That is an example of community. And when we look at what our startup, but I think, John, you and the GeekWire crew, you guys have done a very good job of trying and successfully in many ways building community. This is an extension of that, and I think I love it. And I think I'm probably not alone. I think we'd all probably nod our heads. But is that that is scratching the surface of what the music community did in the 80s and 90s in Seattle? Where's that level of sort of commitment, of grit, of supporting one another, of getting together and introducing competitive job applicants? And I think, all we can do is continue to build that. To me, that's what all in looks like. And it's not an ambition to be anybody else. We're going to be us. We're not going to be San Francisco or New York or whatever. We only have the ability to be who we are. If we try and be somebody else, we're going to fail. But what does the community look and act and feel like? That's what we should be doing more of. And when I'm saying shoegazer, I'm not saying bravado. I'm saying that you're not willing to get up off your desk or out of your desk and go talk to somebody across the hall, let alone at an event, a night like tonight, where you might meet some people, meet a new CFO or a new head of engineering or whatever.
Yeah, I would say that the challenge that I see is that I think Seattle is really diverse in terms of the amount of industries that are represented, whether you go from genotherapeutics in biotechnology to things going on in aerospace to software. And this is one of the things we love about it at GeekWire. I mean, there's this amazing cocktail of interesting stories across this wide range of industries that we get to cover. And so I think in that standpoint, it is really quite interesting from an editorial standpoint of what we get to cover. The sense of community, I think, is interesting, though, because the grunge community, you could argue, came together because they were very niche and they were very connected into the music scene. I think one of the challenges is, I think, as we mentioned with Amazon being kind of siloed, or the biotechnology community being siloed, it seems there isn't enough connective tissue across those industries that people do come together to build things, to talk, to network, to get, stop that shoegazing. So I'm not sure how we solve that, or if we're going to solve that problem tonight, because it is a cultural thing to dive into. I do want to circle back just on the question of what Seattle can do to make sure that a rising tide lifts all boats here. And I think it is an important question to ask. On my Lyft ride here tonight from our great offices in the center of the universe in Fremont, I got a lovely ride from a Mexican man who he just started asking me what I was doing, and I said, I'm going to go moderate this panel at MOHAI, and he's like, what's it about? And I said, startups and tech and the future of Seattle, and he's like, oh my gosh, that's a big topic. How are you going to cover all that? And I was like, well, what would you like to hear? And he was great. He was talking about, well, I'm really into computers, and I had a startup in New Jersey, and I came to Seattle, and I couldn't quite get it off the ground, and it just didn't take off, and he works in AV at the Bell Harbor Conference Center, and so gets to hear a lot of presentations and talks. A lot of technology companies come through there and have events. And he was saying, I've been there for, however many years it was, and there's never a Latino speaker, ever. I mean, he's like, I've never heard anyone. He said, it feels like the Latino community here has been completely left behind. When it comes to the boom in Seattle and the technology revolution that has occurred here. And you could insert other, ethnic groups into that bucket, whether it's African Americans or what have you. It's just there's a group of the society here in Seattle that is it's not being brought along. And so I guess I'm asking what the community could do to make sure that as Seattle grows, all aspects of the community are benefiting, and not just by, perhaps increases in home prices, something substantial so the community does stay more cohesive and sticks together, versus what I do think has happened in the Bay Area, where it has really split, and is split in a direction probably that is no longer going to be corrected.
So this is something that I think about a lot, because this is very central to my company. So if you think about one side, which is parents, and I think if there were a side that a lot of us identify with, it's probably that side. Well-educated, high income, great homes. Sure, we can talk about if we've owned a home, how our homes the prices are rising. Great, and if we're not, we're renting, fine, we can sort of talk about, the rising rents. It's the other side that I get to see, which is all these caregiver communities, and how they are struggling to make a living and what their situations are when they're talking about like what their rent is or how many jobs they're working and all that kind of stuff. And I think what's really interesting to me is that when in my past career, when I used to work at Procter & Gamble or Adidas or Starbucks, I was still in a rarefied kind of world of a small set of people, but I still talked to more international folks or like a different stratum of folks. Now I feel like I'm much more focused on a subset of tech folks that work on these types of problems within this type of income level. And it isn't until I'm talking to these other young people, but often like we have caregivers who are stay-at-home parents who are from all manners of walks of life. And we have this sort of this tension because in our business model or my model is that I believe in the power of neighborhoods. So I believe in neighbors helping neighbors, right? So a caregiver that lives in Capitol Hill serves families in Madison Park or Capitol Hill. Now, the challenge for that is there's not a lot of housing for those folks to be living in Capitol Hill for very long. And so now they're headed to Edmonds or they're headed down to Renton. And now I'm having the conversation of, does it make sense for them to be driving 45 minutes in to do a 2-hour booking? I'm talking to parents of like, why are you implementing 4-hour minimums? These are really complex things, and we're in the center of it. And it's just fascinating to me because amongst us, like very privileged with my background and like, what we're able to make and everything like that. But if I think about how Seattle's changing and all these amazing people that are coming in for Amazon or Microsoft and everything else, I think what a lot of times we don't see are these other people that we're not interacting with, like maybe at a coffee shop or something else. But I think I don't have an answer. This is part of what I have to solve for my company, sure. But I think about community. I think about, who are the people who are taking care of our kids? Who are the people who are taking care of our elderly? Just school things and all that kind of stuff. And if we're thinking about that, our communities are becoming a lot more siloed. And so that, I think, I don't have any solutions here, but I think it's something as you're just going about your daily life, as you're thinking about, access to different services and things like that, I think there is a huge population of people that live a very different reality, and they're literally just next to you. And I think it's just a fascinating thing that over the last year and a half have become a lot more aware of. But I think that is actually one of the biggest challenges that Seattle's going to face because it's driving people outside of the core, and that has huge implications.
How do we solve it? What's a fix? What's one thing people could do to try to...
More startups. I think the answer is innovation. I do. Like, I don't know. Like, down in the valley, we're talking. There's startups that are talking about communal living, right? Like, more affordable living that actually solves a couple of different problems. Obviously, from the cost, but also from like the feeling of like living in with close to different people. I am such a huge believer of solving the problems that you're facing, right? So if you're one of these young people that is facing, high rents. And whatever else, band together with a couple of friends and let's go figure out, a startup or something that can solve it.
One of the startups in the Seattle 10, Loftium,
that's right.
is a great example of this.
That's right. That's exactly.
They essentially are helping younger homeowners purchase homes and then setting up an Airbnb system within it to help pay for the cost of the home. So it's a great example of it's a younger entrepreneur that's leading.
That's exactly
charge.
it. And there's probably 5 other ways that you could, take a crack at that.
There are some interesting communities who have solved this on their smaller scale. Believe it or not, Aspen you'd think of it as a place rich people go to ski, but they have actually created a model that, is built into their economy is affordable housing for people who work there. And it's a more distributed approach. So this is a public policy issue around housing. I think that is so incredibly important and challenging. It would require us to think differently, and some of those different ways of thinking involve more socialist ideas or mindsets, which is very challenging in today's environment.
Are you going Canada on us?
I think sharing is okay. I think sharing is okay. I'm a believer in sharing.
Yeah.
And I think that at the basis of that means like if we want to have a community, it involves sharing with those who have less. And so I think that's an approach. I'm not convinced that is going to happen because I think it's antithetical to a lot of the principles around which the country is built, and that's really challenging. But I think that if we don't start thinking like strategically and in an innovative way around things like that, I think it's hard not to go down that same path of the haves and have-nots, which has been this trajectory for decades, not short amount of time in the country where we have the rich get richer and the poor get the picture. It's not an easy thing to change when the pace of wealth gain and cost of living is rising so rapidly in this city we live in.
Well, I didn't even get a chance to get to my AI and jobs question, and I know we want to have some audience Q&A too. So if you have a audience question, just
I'm just saying it's really hard to not let me talk about that last question.
Go for it while we wait for people to raise their hand for.
You guys think about your question.
Yeah, go ahead, Chase. This will be the filler before the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm happy to be the filler. I couldn't agree more with Kristen's point. Like Seattle, you got to get your head out. Density, building affordable housing. We have to do that in this city. If you want to see a terrible outcome of what making people live outside of the city looks like, look at San Francisco. That is part of the reason that the city is, as you said, sort of a shell, is because the people who work in that environment can't live there. So thing one. Thing two is, and I hate to sort of bring this thread back, but it's this diversity. Like the best things in my life have come from outside my immediate circle. It's when we were able to look up and reach across the aisle, get a different perspective, whether that's gender, sexual preference, that age, race, any of these things. Like that's our diversity. Absolutely is our strength. And part of my comment about shoegazing is it's very hard to get diversity when you're sitting around with the 10 folks. And that's part of what I'm hoping. I think the best industry gets developed when you take ideas from other industries. So I don't like seeing fintech hang out with fintech. I'm in ed tech, technically. I don't run around with any ed tech people. I try and spend time with people that are in different things. And I think that there's just an undercurrent, a consistent fever of that idea that we need to double down on. I hope that was enough filler. I was waiting for
That's great. I did see a couple hands. If you do have a question, come on up to the mic. Why don't you line up so we can just go through the questions? Yeah.
My name is Shri. I wanted to ask about this idea of having a community that's together, living together. And that made me think about a problem that's happening today. At a community level, that I understand that, but at a granular level, a property owner decides to develop his property and sell his property at market value. How do you argue with that? The reason I bring it up is because I'll give you an example. At First and Pike today, there is a Green Tortoise hostel in Hahn Building. It's a 3-story building, older than Pike Place Market itself. The owners are planning to demolish that building to build a hotel, 14-story hotel, right? There is a community of people in the market who feel that's sacred. We shouldn't disturb that intersection. That's historic Seattle. We should preserve it. But I see the perspective of the owner. It's his property. He wants to develop it. The ordinance and regulations allow it.
One of the saddest things that ever happened in the history of Seattle to me was in my neighborhood of Ballard when they tore down the Sunset Bowl. Oh. And I thought that was a community asset that disappeared that should have been preserved because it was a profitable, great business. It brought community together, and it was more condos. So I hear your point. What's your question?
So my question is, we have from the media, we have people from technology, and a lot of people who live in Seattle. What do you guys think about how we should handle something like that? I mean, how do we preserve something
I'll answer that quickly and I'll turn it over. But I think it's incredibly important to preserve our past. Obviously, a history major, and we're here in the Museum of History and Industry that's trying to preserve our past and celebrate it. I look at things. Every time I'm in Seattle and I walk into Pioneer Square and I see that horrendous triangle parking garage at this corner of, I don't know what the cross street is, but you know what I'm talking about. It's the sinking ship parking garage. And it's an absolutely hideous thing. It's a concrete slab right there in the most beautiful corner of our historic district. It's awful. Now, that's the bad news. It sits there and it's there. The good news is that when that happened, and Leonard Garfield here at Museum of History can correct me, but when that happened, it actually did mobilize the community to say, we can't let this happen again. We cannot let a historic building like that be torn down. And so it marshaled the forces of Seattle to make sure that the rest of Pioneer Square was preserved. And so in that case, there was a positive impact. But the challenge, I think, in Seattle is it's changed so quickly, so fast, and people, we just can't keep up with the pace of change, and we're not sure how to get our hands around it. We're actually going to Pittsburgh as part of the GeekWire team in the month of February, part of an experiment we're doing called GeekWire HQ2, a little bit of a spoof off the Amazon HQ2. And we're going to Pittsburgh, and I've been studying up on Pittsburgh, and I've been learning a lot about this industrial Rust Belt city and its transformation. And one thing I just picked up on today was there are developers in Pittsburgh who have a no teardown policy. Like they're preserving tons of their old historical legacy, and they're just working with it. So I think this city could do a lot better in terms of reusing what is here. This is why I'm actually kind of glad about Key Arena, and let's repurpose Key Arena. Let's not build another arena. But that's my own personal take. I'm not sure if anyone else has anything on that, but thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Let me add something quickly. There is a petition. If you feel strongly about it, there's a petition in change.org to preserve that building. So.
Well, thank you. Thanks for bringing it to the attention.
Hi, my name is Joyce, and I quit my full-time job in June of last year to work on a company.
Congrats.
Thank you. And I am trying to solve part of the housing problem, although probably not with supply. I guess my question is, I've been trying to get people on board for about 8 months. I'm a developer, so I know a lot of other developers. And the problem that I always run into is that they don't want to quit. They don't want to lose their next vest. They don't want to quit their cushy job where they have really, really nice benefits. I think part of the reason is because compared to San Francisco, you can live much better as a developer here. And so there's really no reason to take the risk. I guess, so then the question is, how did you get people on board in that type of environment?
That's
how did you get collaborators?
How did you get your first 2 or 3 key employees that have stuck with you?
Crazy fool, comrade in arms. I've been working with the same team for 20 plus years. We've just done 5, 6 companies together. So we just foolishly try one idea after another, and that's kind of worked for me. As your first money, your first hires, any entrepreneurial activity, to Chase's point, you're selling. You're selling to hire an employee, you're selling to convince someone to invest in you, you're selling to a customer to buy your product or someone to download it and engage. So you've got to be really good at selling on the vision, the idea, the opportunity, what if, look at this, okay, give me half your time, give me a quarter of your time, I'll take whatever I can get. And you just pull them in and get them emotionally invested in the idea and the problem that you're solving. And that's where meeting other like-minded entrepreneurs and people that want to challenge this problem, or hackathons or whatever. There are people that are tackling, there are tons of creative developers posting, free software downloads and, contributing to open source software and programs. If that's appropriate to what you're building, engage with them, even if they're remotely, and just see if you can emotionally get them invested in what you're building. But you've got to be selling. The onus is on you to convince others to join on your crazy ride.
So, Avni, how did you get the first few folks?
Yeah, so I'm on the complete other end. I started a tech company without a CTO, and I'm not technical. So for me, it's always been about growth, right? So you have to, it is always about selling, but it's also about growth. People want to join something that's exciting, that's growing, that has potential, right? So I think the best part for raising money and or hiring in the early days, but even now, is if you are building something that has momentum, that is growing, people want to be a part of that. It's just human nature. And so whatever that is for you, whether you've got a product and you're already, you have some customers or whatever else that is, and then you have to sell that vision and that dream to those people. But for me, I like the adage that growth solves most problems in the world of startup, and it really does. If you just focus on growth, most of the problems that you have in front of you.
Semi worked for Uber.
That's bot growth. That's a whole nother thing. That's a different panel.
Yeah, you can use the Steve Jobs line that I used. Who was it on John Scully with that Pepsi? You can continue to sell, sugar water for the rest of your life, or come do something really transformative and amazing. I've used a variation of that at GeekWire with folks. Not that eloquently.
And I think sell with your heart and be really clear about the purpose, especially if you're recruiting someone who's under the 40, but even people over 40. But just what is the purpose, to your point? What is the purpose of what you're doing? And sell with your heart, not your head, because that will compel people to spend some time and give you a few minutes for free and then hours and days.
Okay, and then just one pitch for my company. It's preventing scams on Craigslist, and the website is cluckcluck.co, and it's live. So thank you.
Cool.
Great.
Awesome.
By the way,
way to
nice
sell.
work there.
Good job.
That was awesome. We need more of that.
Yeah.
Good job.
There
Do
you
it.
go.
Hi, my name is Kim, and thanks for putting this on. I really appreciate that you guys are willing to share what you've done. My question is, how did you go from, the land of familiar to the land of unfamiliar? And what was the hardest part about that? And what I mean by that is, like having a job, that's what we're all taught to do, go to school, get a good job, and you live a good life, versus going out and starting your startups and battling the dream stealers.
So I'm a really actually risk-averse person. If you look at my career previous to startup, you would never have guessed that I would have go and not throw it all away, but set it aside and then start a startup. The way I think about this is I actually create parameters from which that allows me to go operate within a very, I guess, risky space. And so what I mean by that is when I decided to leave my job to go explore startups, my husband and I talked, and we said we're going to set aside a year. We can go without your salary for a year, and within that year, you've got the space to go do what you think you need to go do, and we've got about this much money that you can use to bootstrap. And so what that gave me was a clear conversation. In my case, my husband. If you guys have other folks that you need to have that conversation with, some of you guys don't, and you can decide that for yourself. But that then gave me the space of a year and this much money to be able to go do that. In my story, that turns out I spent most of that on my first startup that actually ended up failing, but a ton of learning, so that was really good. But for me, then that turned into a little bit of money left over and a couple of weeks to start what is now Poppy. But what helped in that sense, as I was shutting down my first startup and saying, do I really want to go back and do this again? Because again, it feels like I haven't been successful. I don't have any data to suggest that I could be successful. What really helped me was saying, what would I need to see to make this actually be something? And so I set just goals to just say, hey, if I'm going to do this and I can get 4 people to buy this, and next week, can I get 6 people to buy this? And the week after, can I get 8 people to buy this? It doesn't sound like a lot, but on a week-on-week basis, it's like more than 10% growth. And if you are just like sort of heads down and saying, if I can get 10% growth on this, then I have something. And if I don't at the end of some period of time, then maybe I don't. And so that sounds like a uber kind of like data-driven kind of way, but for me, as someone who is actually fairly risk-averse, who actually came into startups on the opposite end of what you suggested, which is after having a really great career, 2 kids, mortgage nanny, all of that stuff, how do you throw all that away and then just say, yes, I actually want to go pursue startups? There's a huge opportunity cost there. And so if you're in that kind of position, then that helped me, and so maybe that can help you.
You've got to be good at something if you're going to pursue a startup. You've got some domain expertise, some talent, some skills, some knowledge, some insight that's going to lead you to thinking you're successful in that. I've done 6 startups. Every single one of them was basically conceived as kind of a joint venture with a much larger incumbent partner, biggest player in the industry doing XYZ. If you can find yourself where you're so good and you think you're so talented and you've got this magical insight and you've been in some industry, convince the other people in that industry that only you can do it and that they should back you to go do this.
Yeah,
Love your boots. Love your boots.
Hi, my name is Hector. My question is for Chase. I was wondering, how did you come to view the world the way that you do now?
Oh, wow. Wow, I feel like there should be a couch up here now.
I grabbed my beer.
It's a big one.
Well, thank you for the question, Hector. I do think I would have to give a lot of credit to my parents, but I think what we I'm going to go to Tony Robbins land for a second here. There's three sort of things that control the universe. There's the state that you're in, the story that you tell yourself, then the strategy that you go to execute on the world. And if most people that I know, they're always operating at the strategy. They think if I just move this lever or talk to this person or do this one strategy, that everything's going to work out. But the reality is, unless you start at the very bottom of the pyramid and you've got your state in a good state, which is why more than anything I advocate that founders take care of themselves. I lived for 10 years off less than 5 hours of sleep. I bragged about it. Okay, it had huge health implications for me I didn't really understand at the time. But I got my state in a good place as a young person, and that allowed me to tell myself and the people around me good stories, positive messages. And for there, like the strategy, which we walk around in this world thinking that if you just had the right idea and the right people, that it would work. If you have a shitty mindset, the best strategy in the world is not going to work for you. So whether it was at a young age or my parents or I don't know, but I think living one's life with those sort of priorities, that the first thing you have to do every morning is wake up and make sure that you are in a state where you can face the world and be successful, and then you can tell yourself great stories, tell great stories to the people around you, whether you're selling or buying or helping people get excited about your idea. And like the strategy, which sounds like the hardest thing, then if you've got those thing one and thing two under control, that's the easiest part. So we'll get a beer after this thing, and I'll tell you the rest of the story. Thanks, Hector.
Thank you.
And as far as your question earlier, John, I think as one of, if not the only Latino person in the room, my extended family mostly lives in the Yakima Valley, Central Washington area, doing agriculture there. And there's no way in hell you'd ever be able to convince them to move to the west side when the prices for living are much higher and the likelihood of them getting a job is much lower. So I think maybe the answer for, or at least part of the answer for why you don't see many people who look like me as CEOs for startups is just because there's not that many people, or like Latinos that live here. They're not incentivized to live here.
Yeah, good point.
Hi, my name is Lisa, and I run an entrepreneurship club on UW's campus called Startup UW. And so my goal was to basically cultivate a community of doers. And we've had a really good year doing that, but I think an issue I've run into is I've ended up cultivating a community of like sit around and ponder, or like sit around and thinkers, and it's really hard to convince college students who are really involved in like classes and they're thinking like, oh, I'm gonna go corporate, to like do something. And I know it's kind of a broad question, but like, how do you get a college student to like do something?
Sorry, I'm laughing because that was the foundation of Koru, and Anne, who's sitting there, ran the programs to help college grads get jobs, but it was all by making them do things. And the way that we helped them to learn was experiential, and we pulled them out of their comfort zone and made them solve a problem. And we put a high stakes outcome, which was you will stand up in front of a group of people and present your findings, your solution, which you tested and failed and ran in front of customers and had a paper prototype that didn't work, and then talked about that struggle and that journey. When they started by being frozen and not wanting to get out of their comfort zone, and by the end of this process, after we figured it out after a period of time, it was kind of amazing because they got out of their comfort zone and they failed. Because academic environments are all about avoiding failure, and living and learning and innovation is all about failing. So there's this huge gap in between those two things. And you're trying to create a startup environment in that environment of fear of failure and, actually no tolerance for failure in the academic environment. So you have your task cut out for yourself, but I would say bring people that are around you who can share with that group of people that they help them shift their mindset around that, and really encourage that opportunity of getting through some failures to learn. The experiential learning cycle, right? Do, learn, as opposed to learn, do. And it's amazing when you start it, it changes everything. But I empathize because I've been in your shoes.
I've got a funny story that I've taught entrepreneurship at my college a few times. And I got arrested in college for drinking in public, and I had to do community service to get it off my record, and I had to do, I don't know, 40, 80 hours of community service. I was a fraternity at the time. So there's a race coming up, and they were short of volunteer coordinators. So I convinced them that any hours I did would count towards community service, and any hours I brought volunteers to the event would count as community service. So I got the pledge class of the fraternity to all volunteer for this race, and I knocked out all of my community service hours in a single weekend. And but then the fraternity supported volunteering that race, you know, in perpetuity, essentially. So just start something. Just do something.
Bribery.
In my case, I was forced to be creative on how I was going to accomplish something. It's the first time I learned scale. Hey, I've got 20 people. What do I do, you know, to try and achieve this? But from that point on, it created an institution. So just get started with something. Lead something. Evangelize. Start something.
I also, just the small point that I think is important, that I think it's really important to encourage people towards entrepreneurship, but I really think we need to stop at convincing. Because I think entrepreneurship is just so hard that I feel like there's a lot of people that are trying to convince other people that they should go start something. If they don't feel compelled, and if they're not like obsessed about it at night, then don't. Like, seriously, just don't. Until you find yourself compelled and that you have that problem, go live your life, go meet interesting people, go have interesting experiences, and then you'll be able to connect those dots in ways that you never knew you would be able to. But I think that's one thing that's a pet peeve of mine in this learning, is that there's some folks that are trying to convince other people that, no, we should go start, even in the female founder space, right? I am one of the biggest supporters of more female founders, but they should be female founders that want themselves to be starting a startup and understand what that is. So I think for your job is cut out for you, but instead of convincing, figure out how you can then be supportive and then connect them into the ecosystem.
Yeah, kudos to you for coming. Like, this is exactly, you're not in your basement, you're out here asking people who've done it an important and smart question. So, bravo.
That's awesome.
Cool. We only have a little bit of time left, but I want to try to get through both these questions. So,
hi, I'm Iman. I'm currently employed by Microsoft. I'm actually working on my own idea and a product which we've actually launched now as well for over a year. So my question is more about, I think, something that we maybe already discussed in this panel, but it's more about, you said that looking at your shoes and then just build the product, whatever you're thinking, and then go do the marketing next, versus first marketing strategy comes first, and then you do the building, you find what you're doing or what other people are thinking about, be more loud, be more, so people can hear you, and then build the product actually. So I think there would be a trade-off between these two, and then how do you choose, how do you find out the right mix of the two that is actually going to make the idea more successful?
May I?
Yeah.
I think there's a flaw in the assumptions that you make that it's either one or the other. A lesson from startup culture that I've learned, I don't know if I think you have to do all of that shit at the same time, all of the time. I love you to death, but there is no formula. You have to be marketing and talking and building and recruiting and thinking and strategizing all the time. There's no waterfall development schedule. And those things exist, but those are subsets of the thing, which is all of the things. I have never, as the CEO of a venture-backed startup, we've raised more than $50 million. It is never, should I do the really smart thing or the stupid thing? It is, which hand do I cut off? And you're like, well, I kind of need them both. It's like, it's always a decision of which is the worst or the best worst thing to do, or the hardest choice to make, and it's an ecosystem of all of those things. And so I love that you're willing to sort of ask the question also as you embark on your journey. I think just remember that there's never a time that you're not selling, and there's never a moment that goes by that you're not realizing that you could be doing something better. That it's a constant cycle of improvement and iterating, and it happens when you sleep. It happens at 8 a.m. It happens when you're not expecting it. That's actually what it means. Mark Cuban told me that he believes that business is the hardest sport in the world because it happens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're not playing in little increments. So I can't wait to see what you do.
Yeah. It's totally whack-a-mole, like you got to hit the latest thing that's come up, and there's like more of them than there are of you. But one thing I would say, which especially coming maybe from an environment with a lot of resources, make something and find if someone gets excited about that something, and then try and get you to give you money for that something. So like really bake it down
and
to
then find 100 of those people.
Yeah, the customer, who is the customer, get inside of their brain, don't try and convince them, watch them use the thing, and watch when their eyes light up, and when they go, oh, that's maybe if it did this other thing, just get super in the shoes of your customer, and then don't ask them if they would buy it from you, make them give you money. Right.
But that said, there's a ton of resources now available from, when we started where blogs didn't exist. And so there's startup blogs from, startup CEOs and entrepreneurs, failed and successful. VCs are posting things about what they like to see and what they should see, and the parameters for which they invest and what they look for in companies. So I think there are a lot more resources now. You can just do quick Google searches, and I'm sure you'll find, whether it's a marketing problem or a go-to-market or addressable market, et cetera, question.
Three resources I just wanted to say, like unsolicited. First Round does an incredible job of just content. So any of you guys that read content from like First Round, just get on that distribution because there's amazing articles, long form articles on tons of things. Andreessen Horowitz has a really great podcast. Y Combinator does a ton of things, everything from written to startup school to all sorts of different things. There are really great writings from everyone, but I think those are three notable ones that I think for especially people getting started is really helpful.
Thank you.
Find something that works and then do that a lot. I mean, he's done how many businesses? 6 businesses with the same people? Found something that worked, and he's doing it a lot. He's very successful. Right on.
Well, let me do the little marketing here as well. Let me try that then. So my work is called Tasteboard. It's a intelligent personal food tracker plus a food social network, so people can share what they're eating.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, last question. Make it a good one. A lot of pressure.
I know. Well, been called twice today. I work both at Amazon and I'm a Latino, so. So my question is a little bit like, so we've been discussing about how the Seattle entrepreneurs need to take it outside, talk more, promote diversity. So I have a question a little bit more personal. I come from Peru, from Lima, and I've been working with entrepreneurs there and trying to develop the ecosystem there. And a lot of things is hey, they always say, oh yeah, Silicon Valley, Seattle, all those resources that you have. How do you think we could connect ecosystems globally, right? The Seattle ecosystem, stop being like Silicon Valley. Sometimes it's everyone goes there, but how do you take that to the world and then create more equality also around the world in tech terms, right? Have you any experiences or thoughts that you would recommend to do that?
So I'm pretty involved with the Y Combinator community, and one thing that they've just started is this thing called Startup School, and they were trying to get entrepreneurship to happen all around the world. And one thing that was really cool, the first time that they ran it, is that we, the YC alumni, became sort of the partners, and we would run office hours for a small cohort of people around the world. And so it was incredibly powerful. There were all these people with startups, and the construct was once a week you would do office hours with us, and we would go around, talk about metrics, what their growth was, what their barriers were, all that kind of stuff. And you were held accountable with, 10, 15 of your other peers. These startups were everywhere. My personal cohorts were in Armenia, Pakistan, and India. There were startups in Syria. There were startups. I mean, it was really incredible about people just literally needed a computer, a Wi-Fi connection, and just freaking sheer ambition, just a sheer will. And so I think that experience also taught me if people out there are doing and making all these startups with the resources that they have, it was powerful for me on 2 fronts. One was I have nothing to complain about. With what we have access to, I am grateful every day and invested in making it better, but grateful. And then the other part is that I'm also invested in supporting programs like that, because I think as much as I can pay it forward for all the people that have, helped me, if I can pay it forward, I'm also very interested in how we can pay it forward to other international communities like that.
I think the talent shortage is going to be helpful for other communities. So the talent is distributed evenly throughout the world, and opportunity is not. And that's actually core to the mission of my company that I started, so I'm a big believer in that. And so access to opportunity has been very limited to communities and opportunities based on knowledge of you because you went to the same school as me, or you know, whatever the case may be, you're in my friend network. And now we're seeing that disrupted. So I think the first step is when the talent shortage that has been created by this ecosystem to which those people want and need access will be an opportunity for those communities. And our dev shop office is in Costa Rica, and we have the most incredible data scientists and computer scientists in Costa Rica that we consider part of our team. We go there, they come up, so it's very much we consider them part of our team, and that is done 10 and 100-fold in other organizations. So I think that is a first step, but the systemic way to do it, I think it involves access to the markets and the know-how and the capital that is very centralized, but we're starting to see that somewhat disseminate. Chase talked about the fact that Austin and New York and Seattle are also ecosystems and communities, so that's starting there. But I think globally, the fact that we need to access talent from other countries, and those people may not come to this country, is going to create a really interesting way of access to the know-how and the capital, and also then the opportunities, hopefully.
Start your own company, hire all your buddies from Peru to work for you at a lower cost and an economic advantage. All the offshoring that I've seen, is someone pulling back from their network in Romania, India, China, hiring friends that they've worked with in the past that know and trust. That's one way to develop economic activity on the hiring front. All the technology, hopefully, we're all working on has broader ambition than just Americans and just North America. And there's so many technologies we're all advancing and developing that have global value to economic benefits and improving society, et cetera. So pursue something that you find value and meaning in, and then grow it as you think necessary.
I'm gonna echo Mike. I think we can look for things out there, over there. I want someone else to do a thing that fixes a thing. You got to start. You be an amazing and shining example for what it means to start something here with your buddies in Peru and demonstrate to the rest of the community what's possible.
Great. Well, with that, a big thanks to Chase, Mike, Avni, and Kristen. Great discussion. Thank you so much. And thanks to MOHAI and the Seattle 10 program. It was great having everyone here tonight, and enjoy your evening.
Thanks to everyone coming.
Thank you.